When Saul returned from following the Philistines, he was told, "David is in the wilderness of En-gedi." Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to look for David and his men in the direction of the rocks of the wild goats. He came to the sheepfolds beside the road, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the innermost parts of the cave. The men of David said to him, "Here is the day of which the Lord said to you, 'I will give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as seems good to you.'" Then David went and stealthily cut off a corner of Saul's cloak. Afterward, David was stricken to the heart because he had cut off a corner of Saul's cloak. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed." So David rebuked his men severely and did not permit them to attack Saul. Then Saul got up and left the cave and went on his way. One of my favorite longer narratives in the Bible is the extended story of the rise of David to power. David spends much of his time, before the eventual death of Saul, as a kind of an outlaw, in the vein of some of my favorite legendary figures like Robin Hood and Zorro. He is on the run from King Saul, but always seems to manage to stay one step ahead of him. It makes for great storytelling. And the part when Saul goes into the cave to relieve himself has got to be one of the more thrilling episodes. Except, as you well know, if you are as a voracious reader of Bible footnotes as I am, it doesn't actually say that Saul relieved himself in the original Hebrew text. What it says literally is that he went into the cave to cover his feet. The ancient Hebrews seem to have been enormously squeamish when it came to naming certain body parts or bodily functions. They were very much into euphemism. So, apparently, everyone who heard this story understood what it meant when it said that Saul went into the cave to cover his feet. And his actual feet had little to do with it. But the actual situation that is described in this story is so bizarre that I really think it needs to be retold in a way that brings out all of the amazing details. That is, of course, what I'm here for. This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 8.13. David cuts corners. Saul was exhausted. The work of being a king just never seemed to stop. He had spent the last several weeks fighting sporadic battles against his most persistent enemies, the Philistines. He was leading an army of 3,000 men, with all of the logistical problems that came with that. And no sooner did he manage to get the Philistines to withdraw a little bit than he heard the word of another enemy, a particularly annoying enemy, David. The man had been a thorn in his side almost ever since he had been taken on as one of his warriors. David had been incredibly successful in battle and become a popular hero throughout the kingdom. The man was also ruddy and handsome, and the young women had swooned over him. Recognizing him as a threat, Saul had tried to get rid of him. When David had wanted to marry his daughter, Saul had set for him an impossible task: to kill 100 Philistines and bring back their foreskins as proof. But David had somehow managed to do it and survive unwounded. Saul had even tried to throw a few spears at David himself, blaming it, of course, on a bout of madness. But the young man had dodged those as well. Eventually, David had figured out that he would not likely survive too much longer in the court and gone on the run. He had gathered a gang of outlaws and outcasts around him, the scum and rejects of society. There were said to be about 500 of them, and they made their living by raiding and running protection rackets. As such, David had gone from being an irritant to a major threat to the well-being of the kingdom. And so, while he had his large militia gathered together, Saul decided that it was time to finally hunt the man down. They had followed the rumors and reports across the countryside until they had brought them here to En-Gedi. But the hunting had been terrible. They were in a region known as the Rocks of the Wild Goats, which certainly lived up to its name, as it was full of steep climbs that only goats could navigate with ease. It was also just full of places where even large groups of men could hide. There were caves everywhere. And so the search had been as frustrating as it was fruitless. Saul was feeling as if he was just getting too old for this kind of thing. And he was dreaming of going home and sleeping in a real bed for a change. It didn't help, of course, that he had been suffering from dysentery for about a week now. The sickness had spread widely throughout the camp, but where other militia members could just run off to the side of the road and squat down, a king had to maintain his dignity. So, when Saul needed to take care of his business, it tended to slow things down considerably. Saul called over Abner, the commander of his army. "Listen, cousin," he said. "I think I'm hearing the call of nature." Abner paused for a moment, listening intently before frowning and saying, "Sorry, Solly, I don't hear anything." "No, Abby, you don't understand. I need to see a man about a horse." Now Abner was getting very confused. "But, my lord, you don't even have a chariot." Saul sighed deeply. Did they really have to go through this every time? "Abner, I have to pay a visit to the throne room." "But cousin," Abner responded, "it is a long way back to your house in Gibeah." The cramping in his gut was finally becoming unbearable, and so Saul pointed urgently towards the mouth of a nearby cave. "Listen, Commander, you need to stop the army right now. I need to go over there and cover my feet." And that was when Abner finally understood. Knowing from previous experience that this might take a while, he ordered everyone to stop. The fighting men of Israel threw themselves to the sides of the road, fighting with each other to get a place in the shade, while Saul stumbled towards the dark entrance to the cave, clutching a copy of the Canaanite Farmer's Almanac to his chest. He knew that he would be a while as well. David's company had seen Saul's army coming a mile away. He had learned long ago how important it was to always have scouts watching in every direction. Seeing that Saul's men outnumbered him at least 6-1, David decided immediately that this was not a time for direct confrontation. But fortunately, David and his men had been operating around here for a long time, and they knew all the best hiding places. They moved directly towards the largest cave in the vicinity. The only one, in fact, that was large enough to hold their entire company. One of David's men, Shammah, the lentil lover, had discovered it during the previous season, and it had come in pretty handy ever since. In fact, if you didn't know its secret, and you just stumbled upon it, you might mistakenly think that there was nothing more to it than the small outer cave, no more than a few feet deep. But if you knew where to look, there was an entrance into a much larger cavern that was mostly hidden by the overgrown weeds. As a precaution, David had ordered all of his men into the cave, where they lit a couple of dim lamps and hunkered down. He never expected that Saul would bring his army in this direction, but it was best to be safe. He expected that they would just have to wait a while in safety before moving on. But, much to his surprise, the army came straight towards them. Before long, the sentries that had been left in hiding outside were rushing in and excitedly whispering that the entire army was almost upon them. David's band fell into utter silence, hoping that Saul's army would quickly move on. But there was no reason to panic yet. Only a few minutes later, they all heard the sound of someone entering the outer portion of the cave. David's heart skipped a beat, but he did not make a sound as he signaled to Eleazar's sticky sword, one of his bravest fighters, and the man who was crouched nearest to the hidden entrance, to stealthily peek through the weeds to see what was going on. Even in the dim light, no one could fail to notice the shock that registered on Eleazar's face at what he saw. But he did not make a noise. Instead, he quickly made his way through the tightly packed men until he was at David's side. "You'll never believe what I have just seen, Lord. I'm not even sure that I believe my own eyes. Guess who just entered the cave all by himself? It is the king." "Saul?" David almost gasped in surprise. "What on earth is he doing here?" Eleazar's need to answer that question was immediately negated by a noxious scent that began to spread from the hidden entrance to the cavern. This was accompanied by two disconcerting sounds: a thundering blast and a deep sigh of relief from an old man. Nobody had any doubt as to what had led to Saul's intrusion into the cave. But they were still all so stunned by what was happening that nobody moved for several seconds. Unsurprisingly, the first man to recover his wits was Basshebeth Spears, the great leader of David's famous 30 warriors. Always a man of decision and action, he urgently whispered into David's other ear, "This is it. Yahweh has put your enemy right within your grasp. You can do whatever you want to him." Everyone turned to David in expectation. He knew that he had to do something, and do it immediately, or people would begin to question his boldness and commitment. And so, he began to shuffle silently across the cave floor, making his way towards the exit. By the time he had finally made it into the mouth of the cave, Saul had been in such a hurry that he ripped off his outer cloak and tossed it into a dark corner that was overgrown with weeds. His loincloth was off with but a moment's struggle, and he hiked up his tunic and crouched down. The relief swept over him as he finally relaxed with a heaving sigh. Indeed, you might even say that a kind of ecstasy settled over him for a few moments, as he forgot the burdens that he had been carrying with him ever since he had set out on this expedition. He enjoyed a few moments of peace and bliss that he was unwilling to allow anything to disturb. At least not in this moment. That is the only way that I can explain the fact that he did not notice the strange movement among the weeds in the corner where he had thrown his robe. He did not see the eyes of his hated enemy gleaming in the obscurity. David wasn't quite sure what he had intended to do when he came to the entrance. As much as everyone respected Basshebeth's spears for his boldness and strength, he did not always think through all of the consequences of his rash actions. As much as everyone admired him for that time when he stood alone, armed only with his famous spear against 300 warriors? Or was it 800? The numbers seemed to grow with each retelling. That didn't change the fact that a wise warrior would have found a way to avoid being caught in such a position in the first place. To kill Saul in this cave would indeed be a bold blow. But would it truly be wise? Saul may have entered alone, but that didn't change the fact that there were some 3,000 waiting outside the cave. If Saul didn't return, they were hardly going to leave without investigating. And when they discovered David's 500 confined in the small space with one narrow entrance, it would be like spearing fish in a barrel as they were cut down one by one, trying to escape. Not even the best fighters in the world, including the famous 3, could survive such a slaughter. The prudent thing would have been just to wait and hope that once Saul had finished his business, they would all move on. But, thanks to what had just happened in the inner cave, David could hardly shrink from taking action. As he wrestled with his dilemma, David noticed something. The corner of Saul's cloak was snagged on a small migwort bush and lay mere inches from his hand. He smiled darkly as he drew his dagger. When Saul finally stumbled out of the cave, hurriedly wrapping his cloak around his body, he did not notice that one corner of it was a bit more ragged than it had been. He rejoined his men and, at Abner's order, They began to gather up their belongings. Meanwhile, David returned to his men, clutching the scrap of cloth that he had cut from the king's garment. The warriors stirred around him as he came, clearly wondering why he had not struck down the king, as Basshebeth's spears had told him he should. They dared not speak too loudly, but he could hear many of them muttering under their breaths, some of them even questioning his manhood and ability to lead. David had a temper, but it did not always surface in predictable ways. As he had stood watching Saul doing his business, he had felt little anger for the man who had been hunting him down for some time now. He only felt some pity for an old man who seemed to be a shadow of the leader he had once been. But when he heard the hints of division in the murmuring of his men, David did feel angry. And in his anger, he finally found a way to rationalize the strange action he had just taken. "May Yahweh forbid that I should do what you said to the one anointed as my king by Yahweh. Let no one lift a hand against Yahweh's anointed." David shamed them for even thinking such a thing. And his anger was genuine, in that he did feel as if the position of king was worthy of some respect. But the anger was also somewhat self-serving. After all, didn't he aspire to be anointed himself someday? Some of the men did look a little bit sheepish, but he could still see in the eyes of at least some of them that they were wondering if, when the time of true boldness came, he would be up to the task. David realized that a symbolic cutting of the king's robe wouldn't be quite enough to satisfy them. The situation still called for something a bit more audacious. David emerged from the cave just as Saul's army was about to set out. "My lord, the king!" he cried, bowing down low to the ground. Saul turned around to look, and was stunned at what he saw. Indeed, the entire company fell silent in shock. David, his face to the ground, knew very well that he was taking a big risk here. If Saul ordered an attack, he would be taken, or even killed, easily. But he had calculated that if he showed such submission, Saul would have no choice but to act magnanimously. A king could not afford to appear hasty in judging those who claimed to be his subjects. At the very least, his display had bought him some time and attention, so he continued to speak. "My lord, you are surrounded by people who say I am trying to kill you. But today, just now, Yahweh delivered you into my hands, right here, in this cave. But did I harm you? Did I even touch you? No! David lifted up the bit of cloth in his hand. See this? Does it look familiar? A murmur swept through the whole company. The cloth on the king's robe was woven by his wives and was quite distinctive. Saul grabbed the corner of his garment and examined it intently. Today, you were entirely in my grasp, David declared. I could have struck you down, as you did your business in this cave, but I did not. I would not strike down Yahweh's anointed one. And so, I just cut off the corner of your robe to prove to you that I am not your enemy, like people say. I would not commit treason against you. May Yahweh judge between me and you. Yahweh may avenge me on you, but my hand shall not be against you. Saul was deeply shaken. He didn't quite know what to do. He wept and cried aloud in confusion, David, is that your voice, my son? Saul's emotions were warring within him. There was a part of him that wanted nothing more than to order the immediate destruction of his longtime enemy. But stronger than his impulse to lash out in anger had always been Saul's desire to be loved. It was irritating. Everyone seemed to admire David, even when he gave them no reason for doing so. David could act in the most self-centered and self-serving ways, and people would still love him. Even some members of Saul's own family would still love him. But none of that love seemed to come to the king automatically. Just for once, he thought. Wouldn't it be nice if people just admired Saul for being Saul? Could he find some way to make some grand gesture here? Something that people would remember and tell the story of? He decided to speak in a conciliatory tone. You are more righteous than I, my son, he said. You have repaid me good, whereas I have only paid you evil. As you have explained it, you have been exceedingly kind to me by not killing me this time when you had the chance. Who does something like that? So, may Yahweh reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. We will let you go this time, but beware. Next time, I might not be so gracious. And then, over Abner's sputtering objections, Saul told his men that it was time for them all to go home. The men cheered, of course. Saul didn't allow himself to think too much about whether they were cheering for him and his nobility, or just at the idea of a speedy return to home and hearth. David's men had remained hidden inside the cave throughout the entire exchange, many shaking in fear as the realization of the danger they faced washed over them. While they had heard most of what David was shouting, they had had to guess at the replies he received. And so that evening, after they emerged in wonder to enjoy the freedom that had been so unexpectedly granted to them, they gathered close around the campfire to listen to David's account of the day. When he had finished, they all sat in wonder at what they had heard for a while, until Shammah said, "This is amazing, David. Why, Saul might as well have given you his blessing and declared that Yahweh will give his kingdom to you." "Indeed, he did exactly that, my dear Shammah," David replied. "He asked only that I not wipe out his entire family when that happens." The men in David's company were all in a good mood, and they laughed and drank long into the night as they let go of the tension of an extraordinary day. Like I said at the beginning, this has long been a favorite biblical story. So I really appreciate this opportunity to explore it narratively. As I've noted before in this podcast, there is much to question about the historicity of the stories of Saul and David. The name of the house of David is attested on ancient monuments, so there was a dynasty that looked to him as a founder. But we can be sure of little more than that about the man. There is certainly no archaeological evidence of the extensive kingdoms attributed to these two men in the Bible. And yet, there is something so real and relatable in stories like this one. I can imagine a situation like this happening in the rivalry between one chieftain and his rebellious usurper. Sure, the number of warriors on each side might be exaggerated, other elements in the story somewhat hyperbolic, but that kind of thing is to be expected in ancient literature. The boldness of David is remarkable, but I can actually see him pulling something like that off in a culture that puts so much emphasis on honor and shame. The only part of the story I didn't quite buy was the ending where, in the Bible, Saul declares that God has given his kingdom to David. I can't imagine him actually saying that, especially as, according to the Bible, Saul continued to fight against David and, after his death, his son Ishbaal actually succeeded him for a while. So, I don't think he said that. But I could certainly imagine David claiming that he did, as he retold the story. The other fun thing about this episode was the opportunity to throw in cameo appearances by three of my favorite characters from a previous episode. For more about Bashabeth Spears, Eleazar, and Shammah, and their crazy exploits, listen to my episode 7.5, 3 Men and a Pitcher. That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Please subscribe so you can get the next episode in a couple of weeks. And please rate and review the podcast on your platform. The theme music for the podcast is Da, and the mood music for this episode was Noble Race. The music is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under the Creative Commons, and can be found at incompetech.com. You can contact me on twitter.com at Retelling Bible and on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks again to my awesome Patreon supporters whose support means so much to me. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to support this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.